No, yeah.
All right. All right. Well, good morning.
Morning.
And we are finishing up today the powers and principalities. I guess we would consider these semi-lectures, small lectures that we've been going through. And when we're done today, I thought it would be nice to just ask if there's anything you would like to study. So why don't we go ahead and finish this, and then we'll get to that after the fact. All right. Quick recap. Throughout these last couple of weeks, we've talked about how powers and principalities really are behind the scene, they're in front of the scene, they're people, they're also organizations. We've talked a little bit about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the systems that they represented, that it wasn't just Jesus going against individuals. Last week we ended talking about, we talked a little bit about legion, right? So even within the supernatural, the gospel writers made sure that we understood that the elements of the powers and principalities coming from the Gentile world are borrowed from, right, within the name legion. That it's not just Jewish, as everything in Jesus' world, well, primarily in Jesus' world was Jewish, but we also have to remember that there are Gentiles living all around Jesus, especially in the region of Galilee, right? The region of Jerusalem, not so much, but when you move up to Galilee, you have the Decapolis, you have these 10 city-states, or I guess they were just cities, they weren't really city-states, but they were cities that had a good amount of Gentiles living within that region. So Jesus was in contact with Gentiles. It's just that in the initial part of his ministry, he really tried to minister to Jews, because that's who Jesus, or the Messiah, was initially promised to. This doesn't work out all the way for Jesus, though, as Gentiles are kind of banging down the door to encounter him, right? We have numerous examples within the scriptures. The centurion, the soldier who had his sick servant, he approaches Jesus. The Syrophoenician woman who gets called a dog still doesn't back her down, right? So we have these examples of Gentiles who continually press in on Jesus because, like everyone else, they hear what's going on. They might not be Jewish, but they live around the Jews. You don't have to be in line to know what's going on, because you hear things. You hear things in the marketplace. You might have friends who are Jewish, and you hear things. In a world where there is no MTV, when something big happens, people talk. People talk. Jesus cannot suppress that. And we know that every time he says, don't tell anyone what I just did for you. And then the next line, what do you have? That people were running out in the street and telling everybody what just happened.
That was reverse psychology.
I think Jesus is trying to slow down his enemies. But yes, the word spreads fast. So when it comes to this thought of powers and principalities, it's not just the Jewish people, but it's also the Gentiles. And it's important. We talked about the Herods, right? The rulers, the Jewish rulers. And they are the ruling family, the political ruling family, right? They are more secular than the Pharisees are. They're a lot more secular, right? They enjoy the things of this world, right? They come to us more in the lineage of the Sadducees, to where they enjoy the Hellenistic lifestyle. So as the Romans come in, hi, good morning.
Good morning.
It's okay, well, what's that Who song? Meet the old boss. Right. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss.
Right.
And so it's no longer the Greeks. Okay, it's now the Romans. We just have to learn their new rules, and we'll play nice with them. And the Herods benefited from that, right? They, as vassals, They lived very well. They were not so liked by many of their own people because they were seen as in cahoots with the Romans, and they were. But the Romans, the way they operated, if you played nice with them and if you got them what they wanted, they kind of let you live and do what you want. You could worship whatever God you want. You go about and living your lives. Just behave. Behave. So the Herods, they have their own political system, right? And it's a system that had been around for a long time. Pharisees are the same. It's not that Jesus is going against a group of loose individuals. The systems of the Pharisees have been around, golly, probably since the Babylonian captivity, as when the Pharisees began, the formation of this group around sort.
Could I help with last song? I know that one. That was my mom's favorite hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness, and I know that one, the very last one.
Okay.
I thought I interrupt you.
Okay. Thank you, Miriam.
Yeah.
Again, it's not just individuals, it's a system, right? They live within the bounds of a system that has been created and enforced for centuries at this point, right? Bless you.
Thank you.
And then you have Pilate, who represents the Gentiles, right? Who represents the Roman state. And if you want to talk about powers and principalities, the Gentiles were no different, right? Pilate represents something a lot larger than Pontius Pilate. He represents everything from the beginnings of those mud huts on the Tiber River that have grown into the world power, an early superpower in the Western world, right? So when we think about these things, we have to think about powers. We have to think about organizations. It's not that Jesus is simply going against individuals. So when Pharisees break rank to follow him, when Nicodemus comes to him, it's not just that Nicodemus is an individual. He represents something greater than he. Joseph of Arimathea, right? It's whenever these people come to him, unless you are impoverished and don't belong to a group, but then you do, right? Even the poor were expected to live in a certain way, obey certain rules. This is your lot in life. You stay here. If you had a handicap, it was the same way, right? So Jesus healing, Jesus uplifting individuals, it challenges the status quo. And this scares people who sit amongst this power structure, right? This is why Nicodemus sneaks at night. And so when they have their meeting at night and Nicodemus is there, because they had no idea that Nicodemus went to see Jesus, Nicodemus is probably looking around the room like, well, what has this guy done? And yet he still doesn't say, hey, I went and saw him one night, and you could imagine the oxygen leaving the room and everyone turning and looking at him like, what do you mean you went and saw him, So these individuals belong to something greater than themselves, right? So when we think about the Herods, who represent the political structure of Judea, when we think about the Pharisees, who represent the religious systems, or you think about the Pilates, who represent the Gentiles' systems and powers. They represent something greater than themselves. Think about how they get Pilate. Pilate is bickering back and forth with the crowd, which becomes a mob, right? I mean, an angry mob, as Andy brought up last week, right? You had agitators, give us Barabbas, and Pilate thought, well, this is a great idea. Surely they won't take Barabbas. This guy is, give us Barabbas. He has no choice. Now, okay, I got to give him Barabbas. But they get Pilate by going at him through his own system. What do they say to him? What's one of the final things that the crowd says to Pilate that really forces his hand? Think about it. They say, this man says he's a what?
King.
We have one king who is...
Caesar.
Do you think that those people care about Caesar? They hate the toga he is clothed in, right? But they know that this is the system that Pilate must play in. And that's how they get him. Within his own system, he is ensnared. He's trapped. And Jesus does it. Jesus ensnares them within their own systems too. Because that's how they work and maneuver. And one of the things that Jesus is trying to do is he's trying to liberate people from these earthly systems. Right? He is breaking down social walls, political walls, religious walls that people have built and upkept for centuries. And Jesus is saying, this is worthless. This is no good. It's doing more harm than good. But the people who support these systems, no. What do you mean? We can't do, it's always been like this. Where do we hear that word?
We've always done it this way.
Yeah. We have our own systems, right? So we've always done it this way. You know, whenever you get a new upstart pastor come in, he says, let's try this, right? So, but that's an example of how systems can be created without us even realizing it. We're creating systems, that we live under systems, right? Within our own country, within any country in this world. You know, people live under systems. Some of them are traditions, some of them are official, but they are systems nonetheless. So when we think about Jesus' ministry, always remember that Jesus is not merely going up against individuals. He is going up against these systems that have been there for centuries, and they are very powerful. So when he uplifts the poor, they love it. But the others do not love it, because now he is bucking, and bucking very hard. When we think about the resurrection and what that means, what the cross and what that means. It's the cross that is built, right, by the Romans, right? This is the pinnacle of their capital punishment for the outsider, right? Crucifixions were not meant for Roman citizens, right? It is a humiliating way to be put to death. I mean, you know, to be put to death is not good in any way, but to the Romans who felt crucifixion was for the worst of the worst. And so if you were a Roman citizen, you were spared from this. Doesn't mean that they wouldn't toss you off a cliff, didn't mean they wouldn't lop your head off. They would still get id of you if they didn't want you, but you most likely would not end up on a cross. This was a humiliating way to go. This was a way for people who were seen as outsiders, who were not Roman citizens, who, the term I'm thinking for, seditious to the state. We think back of the Spartacan revolt, right? Who's seen the Stanley Kubrick film, right, Spartacus? Really?
Sorry.
Oh,
Add it to the list.
classic, yes. And you know, that's one of the epics I don't have on DVD. I used to have it on VHS a long time ago. But watch it.
Right on.
It had some, in its day, it had some very controversial scenes in it. You watch it now, you wouldn't blink twice. And that was Kubrick's way, right?
Right.
Kubrick was a very controversial director. But in Spartacus, the actual Spartacus, not Kubrick's Spartacus, at the end of the Spartacan revolt, the Romans took the survivors and lined them on the Appian Way. 6,000 people hung on crosses, right? Now, they could have got rid of these people any way that they wanted to. Why crucify? What does that do? It's they're humiliating them. But what else does it do? What else does it do
It's a message
Sends a message.
to anybody else that wants to think about revolting.
Yes, it's a message. It sends a message from the Roman state. And that message is, if you think you want to revolt, you might do well for it, as the Spartan army did well. I think they took out like 4 legions. They did very well. Nothing like that ever happened again. Armies took out legions, but slaves? gladiators. But this sends a message. If you want to do this, to the woman going to the marketplace who passes by this, to the men who work in the fields as they pass by this, the sight, the smell, what this means. Right? This is representative of the power which was the Roman state. Right? It sends a message, and it sent a powerful message, as those bodies are left there to completely rot and decompose, and not to be removed. Right? So crucifixion sent messages, right? The cross was meant to send a message. In the early days, when the Christians were trying to preach Jesus resurrected, there were some hiccups, especially to the Jewish people or to people who understood the Roman way of life. Jesus is condemned, right? He sedition to the state. He's put to death as a criminal. And so to say that, oh, this is Jesus, here is the one we worship. Some people would say, why? This is a criminal. And so this is where you have some issues, what the cross represents. Right? As Christians, we say falsely condemned. Right? He really was not a criminal, as the Romans said he was. But in ways, he really did. He bucked the system. He bucked more of the Jewish systems than he did the Gentile systems. But then again, he was Jewish. Right? We think about the trials that Jesus went through as he was in front of Pilate, as he was in front of Caiaphas and Annas. He speaks very little to Pilate. He has nothing to say to Pilate. But he speaks greatly to his own people. He lets them have it. But it's not the everyday Jew that he's giving it to. It's the power. It's those who represent the powers and principalities of his day. These are the individuals who he is letting it have. He is unleashing. Pilate is very little. Yes, no. If you say so, you wouldn't have the power unless my dad gave it to you. All right? Very small, quippy almost. And Pilate, in his couldn't figure out why this man was even in front of him. Now, it doesn't mean that Pilate didn't want anything, Pilate said, look, let me just beat this guy and release him. Because that's what he felt, that's the crime he felt, the punishment would have fit that crime. Scourging, flogging. All right, so he's out of line, let me just have my men beat him for a while, and then I'll let him go. But capital punishment for this makes no sense. But then again, he's trapped and ensnared by his own system. And he's forced. Because the Jewish religious leaders are intelligent people too. They know the game, they know the systems. And so, okay, well, if you want to play like that, if you don't want to take the easy route, we'll just force your hand. And they do. He doesn't like it, right? He, as almost like a child who loses a baseball game, puts up the sign on top of the cross at the end, right? Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And when the people say, take that down or change, nope, what Pilate said, and that was Pilate's way at giving it back. Like a child. But you see how they have to, these groups live within their systems, including Pilate. No different. No different. We see it all the time in the Bible. How many times does a ruler say, oh, I love you so much, I will give you half my kingdom? And that never works out good. Whenever you hear someone say, I will give you half my kingdom, just buckle up for the next few sentences, because it's going to get bad. That's how poor John lost his head.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because they are trapped. Because power is enticing, it's alluring. And to be, say in front of all your friends, look what I can offer this person up to half my kingdom. Well, you trap yourself with your own words. What are you going to do now if you just ask for his head? You going to do it? Reluctantly, he does it.
Yeah.
He does it. So the cross represents power. It represents oppression. It represents everything that was bad with the Roman Empire. There were a lot of good things that came out of the Roman Empire. A lot of good things. But there were also a lot of bad things that came with it too. Like with any oppressive force, there's a lot of bad things that come from it. A lot of bad things. If you ever want to see a neat vignette, I don't know if any of you watch Monty Python, but there's a great piece from the life of Brian, which is Jesus' next door neighbor. All right? And if you think of Monty Python, you know that, I mean, they're insane, hilarious troupe of actors, right? George Harrison wanted this movie put out so bad that he funded it. They were not going to be able to afford it, and George said, "No way, I want to see this done." he funded some money. But there's a scene within the movie, and John Cleese is in this scene, and there's Jewish zealots, and they're meeting in a room in silence, and they're griping and complaining about the Romans. Whatever have they done for us? And they keep listing, well, you know, we have a wonderful sewer system now. Remember how bad the town used to stink before? Oh, yeah, it did really used to. In their English accents, oh, yeah, it did really used to smell. Well, aside from the sewer system, what have they done for us? Well, the roads are wonderful now. Oh, yeah, the roads are great now. Oh, aside from the sewer system and the roads, well, oh, you know, we're safe. There's no more bandits running around, and the seas are safe. Oh, that is true. That is true. So by the end of this little skit, I mean, there's this laundry list of all these aqueducts, clean running water. There's this laundry list of things but then they list, and then what have they done for us? Nothing. You know, let's go out there and kill the Romans. So, you know, there are good things that come or that came from the Roman Empire, but there's also a lot of bad things. You know, people are living under oppression. No one wants to live under oppression, especially under an absentee landlord, a foreign landlord. No one should live like that. And this is how the entire Mediterranean world lived. It wasn't just the Jews; it was everyone, all the way to Britain. The Britons lived under them too. I mean, they were everywhere, like ants. So when we think of the cross, it represents all the bad that come with it. When we think of the resurrection, right, it is the same flipped. Jesus is now pushing back the powers through his own power, through the power of God, through the power of the Father. It's being pushed back, right? So Jesus conquers death. Even death couldn't hold Jesus, right? And this is also something where you have the powers, and these are spiritual powers, right? These are the powers we cannot see. Remember in the beginning we read the verse from Ephesians, right? From Paul, who said, our struggle is not against enemies of flesh, but against principalities, against the powers, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, right? Paul says that, yes, we are fighting against powers that you can see, people we can see, earthly powers that you cannot see, and also the spiritual powers, right? What we cannot, the unseen, as we call it sometimes. And so Jesus now battles against the unseen, right? We have small snippets that come to us. I think one from Jude, and where's the other one from? 1 Peter, I believe. How Jesus goes down, right, into Sheol and is released. That even the grave couldn't hold him, right? The powers that we cannot see could not hold him either, right? So when we think about the gospel, when we think about the story of Christ, right, the life of Christ, it's not just earthly, but it's also spiritual. It is the powers that we do not see. It is what we don't think about often. And I'm not saying that there's an imp behind every stone, that lift up a rock, the devil runs out. I'm not saying that. But there are things that we do not see. There are powers that we don't understand. And this Jesus goes against too. It's these systems also. It's not just earthly systems. But Jesus conquers these as well. Right? And Jesus conquers the systems of the Herods, the systems of the Pharisees, and the systems of Pilate. Bless you. It's all of these earthly systems that Jesus conquers, that Jesus goes against, that could not keep him. And these are the reasons that he creates such fear. Because he has no use for these systems. Not that he hates these systems, not that he slams against these systems, he does that too. But he has no use for them. So there's no way to convince Jesus. There's no way for the Jewish religious leaders to convince him. Well, he's already said, I have no use for these. They're useless. Or for Pilate. There's nothing Pilate could offer him to change his mind. Don't you know I have the power to send you to death or to release you? Not if my dad didn't give it to you. Yeah. He has no use. And it's these things that continually rub his adversaries the wrong way. But he never backs down. He never once. He doesn't back down from this. And so when we think about the cross and the resurrection, it's the same thing. Right? It's a continuation. He is put on a cross that is representative of the people's systems. Right? If it was just Pilate, if Pilate was simply ruling and there was no Caesar, and he probably could have got out. He could have probably done whatever he wanted. But remember, we talked last week that Pilate probably wasn't on Caesar's A-list to be in Judea to begin with. And do not fall into the pit like many people do when they say Pilate was a wishy-washy politician. No. We have many secular examples that come from secular sources that show Pilate's heavy hand. Pilate was no wishy-washy politician, and he unleashed troops very freely. Jesus mentions it, and it is mentioned in other places. Josephus, I believe. Pilate was a governor. Maybe not a governor, but he was I don't know if he was a prefect. It goes back and forth. Some people say he was a governor, some people say he was a prefect. There's very little written about him, so it's really hard. But he was heavy-handed also at times. So to try to give him the exit and say, well, he wasn't a wishy-washy politician. He was very heavy-handed at times.
What would be the difference between a governor and a prefect?
That I don't know.
Okay.
I know by title they are different. I think a governor probably has the ultimate power, much like a governor of a state or a province. Well, theirs was a province. And I think a prefect probably has less power. And I think where scholars are beginning to say that he possibly was a prefect, they probably say that, well, he doesn't have, there's not much mention of him. And I want to say he was mentioned as a prefect somewhere else. So, yeah. But sometimes we have to try to understand ancient writings. This is a portion of the world that the Romans really, we're there. We have to be there. It's ours, so you get little. It becomes big within, the Roman world, but not till later. It's not until Christianity begins to grow, and then it becomes a real big problem for the Romans, one that they don't want, one that they thought would eventually kind of go away, right? A flash in the pan, a fad, right? Like fidget spinners. They thought, this will be a flash in the pan, it'll go away soon. Tell that to Constantine, right? So, yeah. Now, when we think about the powers and principalities, it's not just in the ancient world do we see this within the church. Latin liberation theology, right, which is a smaller movement, bless you, than many would like it to be, teaches just this, is that we go against systems and powers that are greater than merely an individual, right? So when you think about the oppression, as people have seen it and felt it in Latin America, scholars have come to the table to figure out it's not just you go against one bad seed or one rotten apple. It's an entire system that you go against of oppression, of corruption, right? And so you have this, an entire theology is built around this. That how do you stop suffering of people when it's not just you go against one, it's you're going against the system. You have to fight against City Hall, right? And systems and sayings like that only enforce the system, because you say you can't fight City Hall, and the system loves that sentence. Keep believing that you can't fight me, right? Romero, Archbishop Romero, right? El Salvador, right? He is performing the funeral of his friend's mother, I believe. And he is officiating over the altar, and I think he was performing the Eucharistic.
Yeah, I think it's during the Eucharist.
And guerrillas come into the church and gun him down. Behind the altar, as he's doing it, gun him down, because he speaks out against the systems. He is a champion for the people and speaks out against the people who are oppressing the people, and is gunned down, killed in the church right behind the altar. I think an altar boy was killed too in that shooting. But it shows that the systems don't like people who come against it, right? So when we think about powers and principalities, right, it is a never-ending cycle. There will always be a power, and there'll always be principalities that the church will have to go up against, right? There's always systems. It seems to be the way that people do things, right? We set up systems, and then the system is set up, and then it's there, right? It brings power. And not every system is bad. There are good systems. There are good things that humankind creates that help, that benefit us. But in that same manner, we can build things that also can be destructive, that can also do
even
harm.
the church
Yeah,
herself.
the church herself. It is. Every denomination has it, right? We talked briefly about it. We've always done it like that. And that's a small example. It's, in ways, we laugh about it because it almost is a joke, right? Because we say, we do say that. People do say that, And, as a minister, I buck against that. I know one day I'll be retired and I'll be saying it. Because, sometimes we all get caught in this trap. But even the churches, right? We deal with it. We set up systems. We have government, right? The church, even it's interesting. Even the denominations who have prided themselves over the years, no central system, no central government, have created their own powers and principalities, their own governments, right? The churches who don't hold to confessions, who don't have a general assembly, they have it. It's there. Even if you cannot see it on the outside, it's still there because it's created, right? It happens. For whatever reason, humanity loves doing that. And it serves, in ways, good purposes. So not everything about setting up systems is a bad thing. It's helpful. We have it in our own denomination. We meet when the session meets. We're ordered. We follow Robert's Rules of Order, parliamentary procedure, right? And session moves very organized most of the time, right? And these are good things. But without us knowing it, they are systems, right? You can call it a committee, you can call it a team, it's still a system. It's still a system. It represents the same thing. Not a bad thing, but it's a system. So as the church, we just need to make sure we keep checks and balances, to make sure that the systems that we have are good, are caring for the people and not doing oppressing the people. And that's huge. Now you might say, well, we're a little, on this scale it's small. But we can understand when you get to a grand scale how it can be done. Because if it was happening in Jesus' day, humanity is the same. Technology might change. We might wear blue jeans and not togas. But we're still humans. We still think the same way. Power is intoxicating sometimes. And that is why we must be careful. right? So when you get someone like Jesus who comes and says, no, you are hurting people with these boundaries. Think about so many of these individuals that Jesus helps throughout the gospel accounts, right? And not only are they oppressed by their own handicap, illness, economic status, right? But they are looked down upon the system itself. The system oppresses them too. So it's not just, okay, the woman is hemorrhaging. I mean, this poor woman is hemorrhaging for 12 years. But you say it's a lot worse than this poor woman having a bleeding issue, right? Because of the type of bleeding it was, right? Because it was a menstruation. Well, you no longer are involved in the temple. You cannot go to the synagogue. You can't be around. You make everyone unclean. And say, okay, well, so what? So she can't go to the synagogue. Doesn't mean she can't go to the movies or, go to the ball game. There's none of that stuff. The synagogue is life. That's all social life is through the synagogue, especially in ancient Judea. She's out. She's ostracized by everyone. So by Jesus healing her, she is totally liberated. She's liberated now to go back into life. And it's because of the system that shut her out. I'm sure that she had friends that would have loved to spend time with her. And maybe they did. I don't know. But I'm sure they were the people who would have loved to but wouldn't because of what was going on. Because they're part of something bigger than they are. So, all right. So that is powers and principalities. That is the end of this. So we have about 3 minutes left.